Now, for more on the tensions and the trade tensions between the United States and China, let's bring in John Quelch. He is the Dean of the University of Miami's Business School. Mr. Quelch, thank you very much for joining us here tonight. Let's get right to it. U.S. markets may be hopeful, not early in the week, but Friday, but others are rattled. Beijing says it's expressing what it calls, quote, deep regret, saying China will take necessary countermeasures. What does he mean by that?
I think by necessary countermeasures, he doesn't necessarily mean a complete tit-for-tat retaliation. There are many ways in which the Chinese can signal to individual U.S. businesses and to U.S. industry difficulties. They can add to difficulties in their marketing within the Chinese market system and cause some considerable disruptions to our multinational U.S. companies without necessarily going for a grandiose tit-for-tat retaliation. A tit-for-tat retaliation is a possibility, of course, because just as in the United States, there are hardliners on this issue and there are doves on this issue, the same is true in China. The Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, probably adopting a more accommodating strategy, while behind the scenes, President Xi also has to deal with members of his cabinet and the administration who are much more hardline and don't want to be seen to be capitulating to United States demands.
Now, on a global stage, the French finance minister is quoted as saying what many people are probably thinking right now, that there is no greater threat to the global economy than a trade war between the U.S. and China. Is there any stepping back from the abyss at this point?
Well, I think you have to note that the place we're at the moment, this has not been precipitated in 5 minutes. We are at this place where we are following about a year's worth of serious negotiations, the initiation of the original tariff imposition around about 8 months ago, followed by a Chinese response. The president laid down a line for March for there to be a full negotiated agreement. That deadline came and went without precipitate action, and now today he has imposed the threatened 100 to 10% to 25% increase in tariffs. The way in which this has evolved has not been precipitous. It has been measured. And I would say that there is still, as the markets seem to suggest, considerable optimism that there will be a sensible resolution on many of the issues that are dividing the two sides. Clearly, the biggest trading relationship in the world potentially deteriorating, that's going to be very bad news for the global markets. And they have, of course, factored in the prospect of the increase from 10 to 25% overnight, but the looming prospect of another round of tariffs on $325 billion of additional Chinese imports into the U.S., even if the U.S. economy is doing as well as it is at the moment and can potentially absorb the damage, that's still going to have a huge impact on the global economy.
John, you talked about the big multinational companies. Let's talk about some of those names that are in China, depending on the lucrative market there: Nike, Boeing, Tesla, Intel, GM. What will this latest move mean to those companies?
Well, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, the Chinese have proved to be very adroit at finding ways to target individual companies internally in China with regulations or inspections or other non-tariff obstacles that get in the way of their free trade in the Chinese domestic market. And through doing those very tightly targeted responses, the Chinese are able to reach CEOs of major corporations who do have influence in Washington. So I would expect part of the Chinese response to involve that kind of reaction, rather than a simple, massive tit-for-tat retaliation.
Gotcha. Now, President Trump has repeatedly said this money is going to come from China, it's going to go into the U.S. Treasury. But break down the rise in tariffs from 10 to 25%. It's going to affect consumers. So
absolutely, you are perfectly correct in your comments. These tariffs, when they are imposed, are paid by U.S. importers, and U.S. importers either have to absorb those costs or they have to pass the costs on to U.S. consumers. At the same time, though, as your report indicated, there is pain in China because clearly Chinese exporters have to rearrange their supply chains, find other outlets potentially for their goods if their goods are no longer competitive on the world market and no longer required to be bought by U.S. importers who can find other sources for the same items.
Well, John, there's a lot to talk about. I'm sure we're going to have you back on again. As we indicated also earlier, it appears President Trump is in no rush to get both parties back to the negotiating table. Only thing to do is look and see where this goes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.